You expect ruins to be quiet testimonials to a past we can neatly catalogue, a name on a map, a ruler's list, a tidy chronology. You expect dirt-stained potsherds, a handful of inscriptions we can translate, and a tidy story of rise and fall that fits into textbook chapters. But what waits beneath the sun-baked mounds of Mohenjo-Daro refuses to be so neat. Here is a city that was planned as if under the hand of a single, practical mind, streets laid out in grids, houses with private wells, an elaborate drainage system that would shame some modern towns, and yet the people who built it left behind no clear written explanation for who they were, why they built so carefully, or why they left so abruptly. From the first moment you stand on its scarred bricks and look across the weathered outlines of courtyards and narrow lanes, a strange tension takes hold. This is both familiar, an urban plan, a marketplace, a bath, and profoundly alien, because so much of what mattered to them is a locked box. I'll be blunt, over the next hours, as we walk the ghosted alleys together, I'm going to give you the best archaeological facts we have, the careful, sober theories scholars offer, and the wilder possibilities people whisper about when they don't want the explanations to sound tame. I promise big revelations, and I promise honest questions that remain open. You will hear about trade routes that stitched the ancient world together, inscriptions written in a script no living person can read, and public works of such sophistication that they force us to ask whether our assumptions about technological progress are linear at all. But you'll also walk with me into the fog of the unknown, the sudden disappearance of a metropolis, the human lives only hinted at by pottery and beadwork, and the myths, lost tribes, giants, an ancient curse, that gather around the site like vultures. Keep in mind, as we go, that mystery is not merely a lack of knowledge. Mystery is the texture of human history when the sources we rely on, texts, continuous habitation, oral memory, are missing. It is where our desire to explain meets the stubborn silence of the earth. So let us step across the threshold slowly, attentive to stone and shadow, to what archaeologists have unearthed, and what cannot be reduced to neat conclusions. Picture the city rising along the bend of a river that once sang with trade and harvest. Picture clay bricks warmed by sun and footprints, the hum of craftsmen, the unlikely luxury of well-planned sanitation. Then feel the chill when the habitations stop, when the streets empty and the lamps go out, leaving us with questions that even modern science has trouble answering. That contrast, between the orderly city and the disorder of its disappearance, is the hook that keeps tugging at scholars and dreamers alike. We will follow the trail of evidence, the seals stamped with enigmatic animals, the standardized weights that point to regulated commerce, the deep public bath that suggests ritual or civic life. We will consider the environmental records trapped in sediments and the chemical signatures in bones, the faint echo of trade with distant Mesopotamia, and the stubborn absence of a readable script. And we will also sit with the less comfortable possibilities, epidemics that raised people faster than graves could record them, shifts in rivers that stole the lifeblood of agriculture, or human violence that is harder to prove from pottery alone. I'll ask you to imagine what it felt like to be a parent in that city, hearing a distant thunder of water or the low moan of a wind that carries dust from a river turning away. I'll ask you to imagine a child dipping their hand into the great bath at morning, feeling the coolness that must have been a communal comfort. At the same time, I will not romanticize. These were complex people with practical needs and social hierarchies, and their achievements deserve respect without being turned into supernatural fairy tales. Still, for all the measured, scientific work we celebrate, there are gaps that science can frame in neat probabilistic terms, but cannot fill entirely. The city resists final narratives, and that resistance is the point. Over the next segments, we will examine specific mysteries, particular places, artifacts, or patterns that refuse to be fully explained, and for each we will weigh what is known, what is plausible, and what remains speculative, always ending with the honest admission that sometimes the earth keeps its secrets. As much as this is a story about a city, it is also about how we come to know anything about the past, about the frictions between data and story, between the patient, controlled dig and the human need for closure. Keep close to that tension, it's where the best questions live. The first thing you notice at Mohenjo-Daro is the scale, streets that cross like axes, the sweep of a citadel raised above the lower town, the sun-baked geometry that suggests a civic mind at work. One quick sentence. The city was laid out as if by a planner who demanded order, and that order is our first mystery because it hints at political organization we can't fully reconstruct. Here's the context. Mohenjo-Daro belongs to the mature Harappan phase of the Indus Valley civilization, flourishing roughly between 2600 and 1900 BC, a range that situates it contemporaneously with the great cities of the Near East. Its houses were built with uniform fired bricks, many streets aligned true north-south and east-west, and systems, public baths, granaries, drainage, suggesting municipal planning that extended beyond a single palace or temple. Measurements matter. The bricks themselves were standardized to a 1:2:4 ratio, repeated across buildings, indicating a shared material culture across a vast region from what is now eastern Afghanistan to the Indian subcontinent's western coast. But here's where it gets tricky. We have no royal inscriptions, no palaces filled with kingly lists, and a script, those small, rectangular seals, stamped with animal motifs and short rows of characters, that resists decipherment. So we can measure the grid, we can weigh the beads, but we cannot read a charter that tells us whether the city was ruled by a council, a merchant elite, or a priestly class. Archaeologists have catalogued artifacts, carved steatite seals, bronze figurines, weights and measures, copper tools, and from these they infer networks of trade, technical skill, and standards of living. Trade links with Mesopotamia are attested by Indus seals found in the city-states of Sumer, and by Mesopotamian texts that mention a people called Meluha, likely the Indus region. Yet we still stumble over basic political questions. Who organized the construction of the drainage? How did the city supply itself with food in a climate that could swing hard? Now, let's be fair, urban planning does not automatically imply centralized monarchy. It could equally imply a complex, distributed civic culture where guilds and local councils coordinated infrastructure. But the absence of monumental palaces, the relative egalitarianism of many domestic spaces, and the prevalence of standardized tools push us to imagine governance forms different from the monarchies in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Still, for all the evidence of planning, we lack the administrative records, a clear ledger, a law code, that would make the social structure legible. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn between two long parallel streets. To your left a row of houses opening their courtyards toward narrow alleys. To your right a line of drains carefully capped with bricks. Imagine the footfalls of bakers, the clatter of carts, and above it the distant light where a public bath holds a community's rituals. Does the order in the stones reflect the will of a single ruler, or the compromises of many hands? We still don't know. Within the city stands the Great Bath, a primitive cathedral to water and to communal life, deep, rectangular, and carefully waterproofed with bitumen and baked bricks. One-sentence teaser: the Great Bath is a monumental puzzle. Was it ritual, public hygiene, or something else entirely? Consider the facts. The structure measures on the order of 10 meters by 7 meters and descends several steps to a main tank. Surrounding rooms suggest changing areas and platforms for spectators. Its waterproofing and the care taken to create inlet and outlet channels indicate an advanced understanding of hydraulics. Such an elaborate, centrally located water feature implies a social importance attached to bathing that goes beyond private cleanliness. Here's where theories split. Some scholars argue it was a ritual bathing space, perhaps akin to purification rites in other ancient cultures. Others suggest it was a civic amenity for a dense urban population. Still others propose a multipurpose function combining ritual, social gathering, and regulation. Think of it as a town square in water. But here's where it gets tricky. There are no inscriptions to state its purpose, and the pottery and small finds nearby offer ambiguous cultural signals. The mythic layer quickly crowds in. Imagine the Great Bath as a site of secret rites in the night, drums echoing through the corridors while torchlight reflected off the water, or as a capstone of a religion we cannot reconstruct. There are also tantalizing physical details. The tank's depth and the steps suggest controlled use, and the channels indicate a concern for hygiene or symbolic purity. Trade connections make such public works plausible. Resources and skilled labor were available, but we must admit the limits of inference. Picture yourself walking the tiled steps at dawn, running your fingers over the cool bricks, hearing the birds that have colonized the ruins now and imagining the voices of bathers who have no surviving text to explain why they came here each morning. Still, for all the evidence of design and care, we cannot definitively assign the Great Bath a single purpose. We still don't know. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of small seals, steatite rectangles etched with animals, unicorn-like creatures, and short strings of undeciphered script, each one a tiny seal of commerce or identity. One-sentence teaser: the seals are fingerprints from a society we cannot read. The seals often bear a seated figure or a composite beast and between 4 and 6 short signs in a script that stubbornly resists decipherment. The seals themselves likely functioned as identity markers in trade or as ownership tags for goods. Their ubiquity, the regularity of signs, and the careful carving point to an administrative or commercial literacy that expressed itself not in long texts but in compact, repeatable marks. But here's where it gets tricky. Without a bilingual inscription, something like a Rosetta Stone, we cannot map these signs onto a language family with confidence. Some have attempted to link the signs to Dravidian languages, others to a lost language entirely. Statistical analyses show internal structure consistent with linguistic syntax, but that alone is insufficient. The seals appear in distant lands too. Mesopotamian layers include Indus-style seals, so they were functional in long-distance commerce. Now imagine a caravan arriving from the west, a merchant holding a seal bale stamped with a symbol that tells a buyer something about its origin or craft. Picture that seal as a brief, durable credential, the ancient equivalent of a shipping label, and think how much of social life is encoded in such small acts. Yet the absence of long narrative inscriptions leaves us with a sense of silence. We can see the tools of administration, but the voice of the people remains mute. We still don't know. The human remains unearthed at and around Mohenjo-Daro complicate the tidy image of a planned, prosperous city. One-sentence teaser: the skeletons and burials raise questions about health, violence, and sudden decline. Burial practices in the Indus region are varied, some cremations, some formal interments, and at Mohenjo-Daro in particular, evidence of both formal burials and hasty interments suggests diverse practices and perhaps crisis moments. Bioarchaeological studies of bones reveal markers of diet, heavy labor in some segments of the population, and traces of disease. Isotopic analyses suggest both local diets and imported individuals who moved along trade routes. But here's where it gets tricky. The skeletal record is sparse relative to the city's scale, and the patterning of deaths over time is difficult to line up neatly with archaeological layers. Some early excavators reported skeletal finds that sparked sensational claims, stories of mass graves, signs of catastrophic violence. But later, more careful work has suggested more nuanced interpretations: urban stressors, disease, and changing access to resources rather than a single apocalyptic event. There remains a mythic temptation, of course: giant skeletons, catastrophic battles, or a plague that swept the city in a single tragic night. Those narratives feed the imagination but demand evidence. Picture yourself standing in a quiet trench where a bone lies half exposed. What would you want to know? Age, diet, cause of death. Science can answer some, but not always all. Still, for all the forensic detail we can obtain from bones, aligning them with social collapse or continuity keeps slipping into uncertainty. We still don't know. The city's economy speaks loudly in objects: standardized weights, beads of carnelian cut with drill technology that rivals later periods, and evidence of long-distance exchange that brings into sharp relief how connected Mohenjo-Daro was. One-sentence teaser: Mohenjo-Daro was a node in a trade network reaching to Mesopotamia and beyond, yet the nature of its economic power remains unclear. The presence of uniform cubes used as weights across the Indus suggests a regulated system for commerce. Bead workshops show skilled lapidary work, and ports like Lahal on the western coasts provide a counterpart for maritime trade. Valued materials, copper, tin, precious stones, appear in contexts consistent with craft specialization, and imported items appear in Mesopotamian records under names that likely refer to the industry. But here's where it gets tricky. We cannot fully reconstruct the polity that controlled trade or how surplus was extracted and redistributed. Was wealth concentrated in merchant houses, religious institutions, or decentralized through many small producers? Competing theories argue either for a merchant oligarchy or a civic economy where standardized measures enforced fairness and cohesion. The mythic overlay again appears: tales of hidden treasuries, lost caravans, or a once legendary fleet that sailed the oceans. Imagine walking through a lane lined with small workshops, an artisan's breath visible in the cool morning, his hands steady as he drills an agate bead. Imagine the caravans that pass through, strings of camel bells, men tallying weights on a palm. These are images that anchored the archaeological facts in human motion. Still, for all the evidence of commerce and craft, the exact mechanisms of economic control remain elusive. We still don't know. Environmental science has illuminated parts of the story in recent decades, and yet the data raise as many questions as they answer. One-sentence teaser: shifts in the river and climate changes likely played a role in Mohenjo-Daro's fate, but how decisive were they? Sediment cores, pollen records, and geomorphological studies show that the larger Indus system underwent shifts. River channels migrated, the monsoon waxed and waned, and that such changes could destabilize agriculture and food supply over generations. Some models suggest a gradual drying and the shifting of river courses away from urban centers, undermining irrigation and trade routes. But here's where it gets tricky. While environmental change provides a powerful explanatory framework, it does not account for the selective persistence of some settlements and the suddenness with which others were abandoned. Human societies are adaptive. They change agricultural practices, relocate fields, and reorganize trade. Moreover, the archaeological layers at Mohenjo-Daro show continued occupation for centuries, complicating any single-cause narrative. The mythic imagination contributes familiar motifs: an angry sky, a flood of divine retribution, or a curse that turns fertile floodplain into dust. But science nudges us toward complexity. Yes, environmental stress. Yes, human agency. But the interactions are messy and nonlinear. Picture standing at the edge of the dried channel where a mill once turned, watching reeds rattle in a weaker wind, imagining families debating whether to stay or set out for new land. Still, for all the scientific data we can assemble, the precise way environment and human decision-making combined to empty the city remains uncertain. We still don't know. There is a technological story threaded through Mohenjo-Daro that often slips under the dramatic headlines, and it deserves our attention because it complicates any simple narrative of ancient backwardness. One sentence to hold: the makers of Mohenjo-Daro were technicians and standardizers who handled materials with a precision that reads like intent. Walk with me down an alley of fired bricks and imagine the thousands of hands that shaped each small rectangular unit into a consistent ratio, 1 to 2 to 4. So reliably that you can map neighborhoods and infer production systems from the ruins alone. The bricks are not an aesthetic whim. They are a signature of repeatable processes, kilns that worked on a scale, molds possibly used to maintain sizes, and social systems that enforce standard building practice across miles. Think too of the drainage gutters that run along the streets, capstones carefully slotted to allow cleaning, brick-lined soak pits, and manholes large enough for a person to descend. This degree of urban hygiene is not the result of accidental wisdom. It implies training, labor organization, and a body of communal knowledge about public health long before germ theory and modern plumbing. Then there is metallurgy. Copper tools, bronze implements, and evidence of casting techniques show a facility with metals that supported agriculture, carpentry, and craft specializations. Copper hoes, chisels, and fish hooks appear alongside remnants of furnaces and slag, indicating a community that did not merely possess metals but knew how to produce and recycle them. Lapidary workshops, where agate and carnelian were cut and drilled with bow drills and abrasive pastes, speak to a craftsman's math and dexterity. The very drill holes are testimony to controlled pressure, rotational speed, and knowledge of material properties. Now, let's be fair. This was not a society that produced iron on a mass scale nor one that left behind towering ironworks. Yet the technologies they exercised were sophisticated in their domain, and their standardization of weights, small cubical stones calibrated to precise ratios, suggests a shared numerical language of trade and production. These weights are not ornaments, they are protocols. Picture a small shop where a woman or man weighs grain on a balance using perfectly matched cubes, the same cubes used along a river port hundreds of miles away. Imagine the skill of an artisan drilling a carnelian bead so uniformly that the bead will pass through a metal clasp far from its origin. There is an almost modern sheen to this precision, a globalized glimpse across millennia. But here's where it gets tricky. The presence of technological know-how does not explain social control of those skills. Who taught them, who regulated the kilns, who ran the trade workshops, and how accessible were these technologies to women, to the poor, to migrants? Competing theories spin different social architectures. One paints Mohenjo-Daro as a set of specialized neighborhoods connected by guilds and trade organizations, a civic economy where skilled craftsmen were supported by communal resources. Another suggests a merchant class that controlled key workshops and redistributed goods according to market power. A more radical theory imagines a quasi-bureaucratic network, perhaps a proto-administrative state that standardized practices across cities to maintain exchange and taxation. Each theory fits differently with the archaeological record. Standardized bricks and weights fit an enforced system, but egalitarian domestic layouts argue against a top-heavy bureaucracy. Now the sensational whispers arrive, machines lost to time, knowledge suppressed by later conquerors, even claims of ancient engineering too advanced for the age. These are romantic but usually unsupported by evidence. Still, the image of gears turning in a lost workshop or of a factory floor in an ancient city is a powerful one. Picture yourself there, the warmth of a kiln, the metallic tang in the air, a line of beads arranged by size on a bench, the soft rhythm of a bow drill, and the stooped concentration of a craftsman whose methods were passed down through generations. Hear the small clacks of cubes falling in the balance as goods change hands. For all the clarity the artifacts give us about technical competence and urban management, however, we encounter a stubborn silence when trying to map technology onto power and everyday life. How were these skills transmitted? Were they clustered in families and caste-like groups, or shared freely in workshops? Why did some technologies flourish while others did not? We still don't know. If technology gives us the how, culture asks the why, and the cultural traces at Mohenjo-Daro both illuminate and obscure. One sentence anchor: the city's cultural life is visible in toys, figurines, seals, and architectural choices, yet its belief systems remain a riddle without a readable text. Small terracotta figurines, dancing women, mother goddesses, playful animals, sit beside miniature carts and toys shaped like animals that would have delighted children. These items suggest everyday rituals, fertility rites, and a domestic spirituality oriented toward household deities and protective figures rather than monumental state cults. The Great Bath's very existence points to ritualized use of water, but were there priests who managed it, or was bathing a civic habit integrated into daily life? The lack of grand temples or royal tombs steers us away from the monumental religion model seen in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and toward a more private, perhaps decentralized set of practices. Then there is the artistic vocabulary, the iconography on seals, unicorn-like composite creatures, bulls, and horned animals, could signal mythic beasts or political symbols. Some seals show a figure seated before a horned animal, a posture that commentators have read alternately as worship, trade negotiation, or narrative scene. These images have been mined by storytellers, lost tribes worshipping strange beasts, an ancient totemic religion, or even contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, wild claims that have no grounding in the stratigraphy. The more sober approach acknowledges that symbols shift in meaning and that without accompanying text their reading is necessarily speculative. We do, however, have the patterns of life, domestic altars, food residues, former hearths and household niches, and objects placed deliberately in foundation deposits. These point to ritual behaviors entwined with daily routines, prayers before planting, offerings at hearths, or the use of amulets for protection. Consider also mortality and ancestry. Some grave goods suggest social differentiation, but many burials are modest, indicating either an egalitarian ethos or a cultural strictness about funerary wealth. Then the old debates rear their heads. Were the Harappans practitioners of a proto-Hinduism, an ancestral Dravidian religion, or something else entirely? Linguistic theories that place Dravidian languages in the Indus or that imagine a substrate language absorbed by later Sanskritic influxes attempt to tie cultural practices to language families, but they rest on pieced-together hypotheses rather than incontrovertible proof. The mythic dimension is irresistible. Lost tribes whose customs were swallowed by later waves of people, secret brotherhoods marking the city with symbols we cannot decode, or religious catastrophes that drove people away. Picture a family in their courtyard at dusk, arranging small clay lamps, whispering the names of ancestors you cannot hear. Imagine the city's festivals, drums in an open square, children playing with spindle whorls, a woman tracing symbols on a seal before sealing a jar for trade. These small acts create a cultural texture we can feel even if we cannot fully translate. Still, despite the richness of material culture, the internal semantics are not easily reconstructed. We still don't know. As we shift from technology and culture to contact and movement, the Indus lifeline appears broader than any single city could sustain. One sentence to guide us: Mohenjo-Daro sat at the crossroads of maritime and overland networks that stretched across the ancient world, and those connections complicate the story of its origins and decline. Goods and materials moved: lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, carnelian from Gujarat, metals from the Iranian plateau, and goods that reached Mesopotamia, where cuneiform scribes recorded dealings with Malaha, a name many scholars equate with the Indus region. We find Indus-style seals in Sumerian contexts and Mesopotamian goods in Harappan layers, clear signs of exchange not only in commodities but also in ideas and practices. Some scholars see these trade links as engines of prosperity, binding distant communities into mutual dependency. Others warn that integration into long-distance trade can also make cities vulnerable. If demand collapses in a partner region, the economic ripple can starve a city of wealth. There are competing economic narratives. One positions Mohenjo-Daro as a producer of specialized luxury goods, beads, seals, dyes, that fed a broad network. Another sees it as an agricultural hub with surplus exchange for imports. Both can be true in different proportions, but the balance matters when diagnosing decline. If trade slowed because of political fragmentation in Mesopotamia or shifts in maritime routes, would Mohenjo-Daro have adapted? Perhaps. But imagine also the human mobility beneath these exchanges. Traders arriving with tongues and foods we cannot reconstruct, migrant artisans settling in new quarters, and intermarriage blending customs across borders. Some isotopic studies hint at non-local origins for certain individuals buried at the site, suggesting movement of people as well as goods. Then the more dramatic theories arrive: conquests from distant hordes, invasions that razed cities, or waves of ethnic replacement often simplified in older scholarship as Aryan invasions. Modern understanding complicates that. Cultural change does not require wholesale population replacement. Often it is the diffusion of ideas and elite language shift that leaves the material culture altered. Still, the specter of violent confrontation, sacked streets, burned layers, mass graves, has been proposed by some to explain abrupt changes. These claims are not wholly supported by consistent archaeological signatures across the city, and many contemporary archaeologists favor multi-causal explanations. Trade reorientation, coupled with environmental stress and internal social shifts, perhaps accelerated decline. Picture a harbor where the water level drops and the sound of different tongues from traders fades, a market where fewer buyers appear, and an artisan whose orders shrink over seasons until he must weigh whether to leave his home. For all the evidence of contact, seals, shared iconography, imported raw materials, the exact political and social mechanisms linking Mohenjo-Daro to its neighbors and determining its resilience remain partly conjectural. We still don't know. Finally, among the things scholars debate most fiercely are the narratives of continuity and rupture. How, if at all, the people and practices of Mohenjo-Daro flowed into later South Asian civilizations. One-line framing. The question of continuity asks whether the Indus urban world was a single chapter followed by silence, or a foundation layer that filtered into later traditions. Some elements, such as certain craft techniques, urban planning concepts, and even possible symbolic motifs, appear to resonate in later periods. The later Vedic texts of northern India, written centuries after Mohenjo-Daro's peak, contain different worldviews and social structures, emphasizing pastoralism and a different pantheon. This has led some to posit a cultural discontinuity. Yet the archaeological record in regions adjacent to the Indus Valley suggests pockets of survival, villages that continued to occupy the landscape, craftspeople who adapted, and burial practices that evolved rather than disappeared. Linguistically, the debate over whether Dravidian languages descend from a Harappan tongue or whether an unrelated language family persisted alongside arriving Indo-European speakers is ongoing and deeply contested. Genetic studies add new data points but also complicate interpretations. Population movement over centuries is rarely a single-wave event, and genes speak to migration patterns but not directly to the flow of ideas or the preservation of religious rites. Mythic stories again surface in popular accounts: lost lineages hiding in mountain valleys, priestly orders preserving secret knowledge, or floating islands of survivors keeping the old ways alive. These stories appeal to our desire for cultural inheritance, but they must be weighed against the slow churn of archaeological continuity and change. Picture the slow descent of a craft. An artisan teaches his child a way to drill beads. A ritual shifts one phrase toward a new word. An old pot form is repurposed for new uses. And imagine how those small continuities accumulate into cultural memory that is both recognizable and transformed. For all the tangled evidence, pottery styles that morph, tools that persist, and occasional iconographic echoes, the line between direct inheritance and parallel reinvention is blurrier than we would prefer. We still don't know. We still don't know. The bronze, dancing girl catches your eye because she is startlingly alive for something 4,500 years old. A slim figure poised with a hand on a hip, a confident tilt to her head, bracelets catching the light that once would have flashed under a sun in a courtyard. One quick sentence to hold: this little statue forces us to rethink personality and individuality in a city often described in bureaucratic, impersonal terms. Think about the technical achievement first. The lost wax casting technique that produced such a thin-limbed, balanced statuette shows an intimacy with metal that allowed an artist to render motion in miniature. But then think about the cultural implication. Here is an image that suggests leisure, performance, perhaps a social space where dance and display mattered. Was she a dancer honored in a household, a votive offering to a domestic deity, or simply an artisan's playful exploration of form? Competing readings swirl. Some say she hints at a sophisticated aesthetic life with performers and festivals. Others caution that singular artifacts can mislead, that a single object cannot be read as proof of an entire class of entertainers. Still, picture her in a courtyard at sunset, lamps lit, the scent of charred incense, and this dancer moving as people watch from benches carved into the walls. That image ties the technical artifact to lived experience, and yet the deeper questions persist. Who paid for performances? Who taught the dancers? What social meanings did such a figure carry? We still don't know. Near the heart of the citadel sits a small, enigmatic sculpture often called the Priest King. A bearded man in a fillet, eyes half closed, a cloak decorated with trefoil patterns. One-line anchor: does this figure represent leadership, ritual authority, or a sculptor's idealized stranger? The statue's posture and costume invite readings of rank and ritual, and scholars have argued for everything from a religious official to a wealthy merchant. Its scale is modest, no monumental throne or scepter to confirm kingship, but the attentive detail in the carving suggests someone of status. Here's where interpretation splits. One camp reads the object as evidence that the Indus urban world had figures who acted as civic or ritual centers. Another warns against projecting old-world monarchic categories onto a culture that left no equivalent records. Now, imagine the statue set on a shelf in a private shrine, light pooling on the carved beard as a family offers grain and thanks for a good harvest. Consider the weight of small rituals in a city where public authority might have been expressed through consensus rather than edict. Even if the priest king is not literally a king, the presence of art that memorializes a person, real or ideal, tells us something about memory and esteem. Yet the larger political silhouette remains out of reach. What institutions upheld such figures, if they existed, and how did they relate to the urban planning visible in the streets? We still don't know. Across the lanes, children's toys, Little carts, animal figurines, give us a tender glimpse into domestic life, but they also complicate the story of labor and family. One sentence tease: the small, intimate objects show ordinary life but also hint at social order and apprenticeship. Toys are not mere playthings, they model adult activities for the young, rehearsing future roles as traders, craftsmen, or farmers. In one courtyard, a toy cart may mirror the real cart that hauled grain to the market. In another, a set of spindle whorls teaches future textile workers dexterity. These items cluster in neighborhoods that show both shared craft specialization and family-based transmission of skills. But here's where it gets tricky. Do toys point to stable family structures or to more fluid households with irregular labor patterns? Ethnographic analogies help but are always imperfect. Picture a child on a threshold watching an artisan at his bench, imitating his movements with a clay tiny tool. That snapshot connects identity formation to material culture. Still, we cannot map the many paths from toy to adult role with certainty. We still don't know. Then there are the subterranean hints of knowledge some call proto-science: careful alignment of buildings in cardinal directions, possible astronomical sight lines, and a rhythmic attention to cycles visible in agricultural residues. One sentence focus: the builders may have observed celestial patterns to regulate their civic calendar and agricultural timing, but the evidence is open to interpretation. Some researchers argue that certain street orientations and the placement of public spaces align with solstices or celestial markers, suggesting observational astronomy used for calendrical or ritual purposes. Others caution that such alignments might be accidental or the result of topography rather than intentional star watching. We must be careful. If you look for patterns, you will often find them, but the temptation to overinterpret is strong. Still, imagine farmers marking a seasonal star before beginning the sowing, priests or elders counting months by moon phases, a communal calendar that threaded ritual and harvesting together. That image gives a human purpose to stone and line. Yet the absence of textual calendars or a known numeral system tied to astronomical observations leaves the case suggestive rather than conclusive. We still don't know. We cannot skip the darker debates about violence and abandonment without acknowledging the way evidence has been read and misread. One sentence anchor: signs once touted as proof of a violent end have been reevaluated, but the possibility of conflict remains part of the explanatory palette. Early excavators reported layers of burning in some parts of the Indus cities and even mounds of bones that made headlines and fed narratives of invasion or internal collapse. Modern re-excavation and reanalysis often show a more complex picture. Some burning layers are localized, perhaps from accidental fires. Some bone concentrations turn out to be later disturbances or ritual deposits rather than mass graves. Still, the possibility of conflict, raids, localized violence, or social breakdown cannot be entirely discounted. The archaeological record is noisy, and it is all too easy to see catastrophe where slow decline might better fit the data. Picture at dusk a street where a house door is left open, jars abandoned, a hearth still warm but no one in sight. Does that signal sudden flight or gradual relocation? The human stories could be dramatic or pedestrian. Both are possible. We must reckon with our own appetite for dramatic endings and the way that appetite shapes interpretation. We still don't know. Now consider contemporary consequences. Colonial-era excavations and modern tourism have altered the physical fabric of Mohenjo-Daro and the politics of its memory. One sentence frame: how we preserve and interpret the ruins today shapes the very mysteries we try to solve. Early digs in the 19th and early 20th centuries often prioritized sensational finds and used methods now judged destructive: large trenches that exposed walls to weather without adequate conservation, and the removal of artifacts to faraway museums. Those practices have left gaps in the stratigraphic record and have sometimes fragmented context in ways that make modern interpretation harder. More recent conservation efforts aim to stabilize walls and protect features, but tourism, looting, and environmental exposure remain threats. There is also the political dimension. Heritage is contested, and narratives about the Indus civilization have been mobilized to support modern national stories and identities, sometimes stretching interpretations to fit contemporary needs. Imagine a child in Larkana or Karachi learning about Mohenjo-Daro as an ancestor site, feeling pride but also seeing the ruins as a resource shaped by outside interests. As custodians of the past, archaeologists and communities must negotiate who speaks for the ruins and what meanings are emphasized. This modern layer becomes part of the mystery. What the past was is inseparable from what we make of it now. We still don't know. Amid these scholarly debates, the mythic possibilities persist because they answer a human hunger that the dry ledger of science cannot. Stories of giants sleeping below the bricks, of secret brotherhoods guarding lost technology, of floods so immense they wiped the slate clean. I am not inviting credulity here. I am inviting you to notice that myth fills the voids science leaves. Myths perform human work, they keep memory alive, they dignify loss, and sometimes they offer frameworks for later communities to claim connection. Picture a storyteller at the edge of a field, weaving tales of vanished kings and buried treasures, children wide-eyed while the night wind lifts dust from the ruins themselves. Those stories are part of the cultural afterlife of Mohenjo-Daro, and they shape how people today and tomorrow might feel when they cross those cracked courtyards. But myth is not a substitute for evidence. It is a parallel conversation that tells us as much about modern anxieties and desires as it does about the past. In the end, whether we privilege seals and sediments or legends and lamplit stories, we return to the same core. Human lives once flourished here, and the traces they left are both luminous and maddeningly incomplete. We still don't know. You step deeper into the lanes and the questions multiply, not like a single tidy knot to be untied but like a web where every thread crosses another, and every answer gives birth to more questions. Picture the granaries. Long, low structures with evidence suggesting storage and redistribution, with floors that show heavy where sacks must have been dragged, and imagine the logistics behind feeding a city of perhaps tens of thousands. One sentence to hold: feeding Mohenjo-Daro would have required agricultural systems, administrative foresight, and seasonal planning that we only partly glimpse in the archaeological residues. Granaries imply surplus and the capacity to move grain across seasons. They imply the social will to collect, store, and perhaps redistribute food in lean times. That, in turn, suggests institutions or customary arrangements, networks of exchange, systems of taxation or tribute, or simply cooperative mechanisms between neighboring villages and the urban core. But here's where it gets tricky: the direct evidence for how grain was allocated, who got priority, how rations were decided, whether elites commandeered stores in crisis, is thin. We have husks, carbonized seeds, storage pits, and architectural hints, yet the human decisions remain mostly invisible. Imagine a magistrate, or perhaps a council of elders, opening a storehouse in a winter when rains failed, rationing out barley while families line up with clay pots. Such scenes could be everyday governance or momentous crisis management. Competing theories alternate between a civic provisioning system that kept urban labor alive and a market logic where access to stored grain depended on trade and wealth. Each theory fits some fragments better than others, and both may be true in different eras of the city's long life. Still, the social choreography of food, who controlled it, and why, remains uncertain. We still don't know. Move from provisioning to policing the public commons. The drainage system that runs like a secret history beneath the streets is both a technical marvel and a cultural mirror. One sentence frame: advanced urban sanitation implies collective priorities and an ethic of civic upkeep rare for the age, but the mechanisms of maintenance are unclear. The drains are covered, sloped for flow, and connected to soak pits, suggesting routine cleaning and an invested labor force. Who did the cleaning? Was it private households, communal crews, or coerced labor under a centralized authority? The pattern of small private wells connected to household compounds also points to a complex interplay between public and private water use. Now, let's be fair. Sanitation could have been motivated by practical concerns, pest control, odor reduction, or by ritual purity linked to cultural notions of cleanliness. Some cultures link water management to cosmology, others to practicality. Both are plausible here. Picture a street at dawn, steam rising as someone cleans the drain with a hooked implement, the city's quiet maintenance ritual repeated daily. That image humanizes the pipes and channels and reminds us that infrastructure requires ordinary, disciplined work to persist. Yet the laborers who kept the drains functioning remain ghostly in the record. Their names and conditions are gone with the silt. We still don't know. And what of the southern quarter where evidence suggests metalworking and large-scale craft zones? One sentence anchor: specialized industrial quarters point to economic complexity and perhaps to zoned urban planning, but the social boundaries of such labor are ambiguous. Sheds with slag, crucibles, and waste cluster in predictable areas, as do workshops for bead making and shell working, craft specialization at scale. That specialization implies apprenticeship systems, resource procurement networks, and perhaps protected knowledge held by families or guild-like groups. But here's where it gets tricky. The social status of artisans can vary dramatically between cultures, sometimes revered, sometimes oppressed, so the material signs of craft industry only partially reveal social hierarchies. Imagine a workshop where a master instructs an eager apprentice, where psalms and shorthand pass down techniques that have no inscription. There is dignity in the labor visible in the artifacts, but the distribution of prestige and reward around that labor is not etched in stone. Competing models frame the craftspeople as independent proprietors, as household-based laborers supplementing agricultural income, or as dependent on merchant houses that controlled trade routes. Each model has implications for resilience. Did craftsmen leave easily when trade faltered, or were they bound to place by local resources and family? We still don't know. Then there are the riverine landscapes that once nourished the city, rivers that braided and shifted, meadows that flooded and receded, and the seasonal pulse of monsoon rains that fed fields. One sentence focus: the hydrological stage on which life unfolded was dynamic, and understanding its shifts is crucial to any story of change. Geoarchaeologists use sediment cores, changes in river terraces, and chemical signatures to reconstruct past waterways, painting a picture in which channels migrate and the floodplain breathes. That dynamism could both bring fertility and betray settlements by changing course or failing to replenish soil. Yet human ingenuity often adapts. Irrigation techniques, crop rotations, and social networks can buffer climatic turbulence. The persistence of occupation layers in some sectors for centuries suggests adaptation. The sudden abandonment of others suggests localized tipping points. Picture a family arguing whether to move fields upstream where the soil looks richer this year, or to invest in a risky new irrigation channel. Their decision is informed by memory and risk, not by tables of statistics. When modern telling seeks a single villain, drought, flood, plague, invasion, it oversimplifies. The truth is a braid of pressures and choices, each amplifying or damping the others. We still don't know. We must also confront the uneasy relationship between early excavators and the sites they dug, preservation, damage, and the contested afterlives of artifacts. One sentence thought: the way Mohenjo-Daro has been excavated, conserved, and narrated over the last century shapes what we can know about it today. Past methods tore into contexts, and sometimes exposed structures to the weather without sufficient conservation techniques, while the export of artifacts to distant museums scattered pieces of a social puzzle across continents. These practices have consequences: disturbed stratigraphy, missing objects, and narratives that reflect the priorities of colonial era scholars as much as the ancient people they studied. Modern conservation tries to undo damage and provide sustainable visitor access, but funding, climate, and politics complicate efforts. Picture a collapsed wall shored up with modern cement, a site map annotated by a scholar a century ago, and a contested debate over which stories to emphasize in a local museum. Memory and stewardship are political acts as much as technical ones. We still don't know who will steward the ruins into the next century, and what stories they will choose to tell. Throughout this, the question of writing remains central. Why is the Indus script unreadable, and what would it take to unlock it? One sentence thread: the lack of a deciphered script is the single greatest limiter to our knowledge, because texts can do what artifacts cannot. They speak in human voice about laws, beliefs, trade, and names. The signs on seals and tablets appear repetitive and patterned. Statistical analyses suggest language-like properties, but the signs are too short and the corpus too small for confident decipherment. Without bilingual inscriptions, like a Rosetta, or a large corpus with clear contextual markers, linguists and epigraphers are left to conjecture based on sign frequency, sign clusters, and parallels in neighboring scripts. There are tantalizing parallelisms, iconic motifs that resemble later religious symbols, but none of these equate to a translation. Imagine unfolding a scroll in your hand that finally states the names of neighborhoods, lists grain quotas, or records a love poem, and then imagine how quickly many of our hypotheses would be confirmed, refined, or overturned. Until then, we must read silence along with the artifacts, and regard that silence as deliberate or accidental, depending on how the script was used. Perhaps most writing was on perishable materials that decayed, cloth, bark, wood, leaving only durable seals to survive. Or perhaps literacy was concentrated in a specialized class whose records were intentionally limited in circulation. Each possibility bends the interpretive arc in different directions. We still don't know. And yet, through all these uncertainties, the human heartbeat persists. Portraits of daily life repeatedly emerge in small, resilient ways: the scratch of a potter's wheel, the soot ring on a cooking hearth, the chipped step of a stair softened by countless feet. These echoes make the past intimate. They are the humble artifacts of everyday existence that carry more truth than any single theory of collapse. Picture a woman at dawn shaping bread, a child watching a sparrow, men bargaining at a stall over a string of beads. The ordinary tenderness of life that archaeologists reconstruct not from proclamations but from fragments. That tenderness reframes our quest. The mystery is not merely an academic puzzle but a human absence we want to fill with faces, voices, and names. Anthropologists and archaeologists are careful to remind us that the past resists us, yet it beckons through the tiny reliquaries of life. Still, for all the tenderness we can infer, the full story, the slow arcs of policy, religion, and politics, and the precise causes of decline, remains partially veiled. We still don't know. When you step back from the stones and let the whole place settle into your mind, a larger, quieter pattern begins to emerge, one that refuses a single tidy explanation and instead invites a kind of humble curiosity. Over weeks, months, years of looking, reading, digging, and listening to specialists argue in dusty seminar rooms, a theme keeps returning: Mohenjo-Daro is less a problem that demands a single solution than a mirror that reflects how humans organize, adapt, and sometimes fail to leave neat records of their lives. We have traced its streets and measured its bricks. We have admired the precision of its weights and the softness of a dancer's bronze curve. We have watched the seals travel on foreign boats, and felt the silence of a script that won't speak. These are the threads we began with, and in the end they braid together into a story that is as much about us, our modern hunger for coherence, our myth-making impulses, our ways of caring for the past, as it is about the people who once shaped those same bricks with their hands. Think of Mohenjo-Daro as a set of choices frozen in clay and stone. The builders chose uniform bricks, and by doing so they expressed a value for repeatability, predictability, and cooperation. They invested in drains and baths, and in those investments they encoded a concern for public health, or ritual purity, or both. They specialized in crafts, and the objects they left behind tell of skill, trade, and an economy that plugged into the wider world. Yet the choices they made do not add up to a single political biography. They may reflect a civic ethos, a patchwork of guilds and household authorities, a merchant elite, or a combination of these. The absence of a readable textual record frustrates our impulse to name the authors of these choices, but it does not diminish the reality of the choices themselves. In that absence, we are forced to read people through their labors, their waste, the food they stored, the toys they handed to children, and the careful way they set water to flow beneath their feet. Those traces are intimate and ordinary in a way that monumental inscriptions seldom are, and they deliver us into a closer empathy with the past. That intimacy is precisely why the unanswered questions are not merely academic. When an archaeologist holds up a carefully threaded carnelian bead or points to the soot on a hearth, they are not offering a puzzle for its own sake. They are offering access to human lives that deserve recognition. The uncertainty about whether the Great Bath was ritual, civic, or a blended social arena is not an intellectual vacancy to be mocked but a space where we can place ourselves in imagination. What would communal life be like if our daily and spiritual practices were interwoven in a public pool? The inability to read the script is not a final condemnation of our curiosity. It is an invitation to invent respectful hypotheses and to continue seeking evidence that might one day tilt the balance toward a sounder interpretation. Science has made remarkable strides. Radiocarbon dates, isotopic analyses, sediment cores, metallurgical studies, and each technique narrows possibilities even as it opens new complexities. The result is an archaeology that is not a museum of facts but a living, sometimes contentious conversation. We must also face the uncomfortable truth that our modern interventions, the excavations that exposed walls to sun and rain, the museums that scattered artifacts across continents, the tourism and politics that shaped narratives, have themselves become part of the ruins' biography. Mohenjo-Daro's story continues in the hands that conserve it, in the policies that fund or neglect it, and in the way local and national communities claim it as heritage. That modern layer complicates how mysteries persist. Sometimes things remain unknown because evidence was destroyed or moved. Sometimes interpretations harden because they suit contemporary identities. This is not consolation, it is a call to stewardship. If we want to reduce the number of we still don't knows in future decades, we must commit to methods that protect context, invest in local expertise, and regard ancient sites as living conversations with the past rather than as trophies to be possessed. And yet there is something deeply humane in the fact that many of the questions resist final answers. Human lives are not always preserved as clean narratives. They are messy, overlapping, adaptive. This is a comfort to those who fear that without monumental kings or dramatic cataclysms a past society might be uninteresting. On the contrary, the ordinary, day-to-day complexity of Mohenjo-Daro, children's toys, washing by a public pool, a craftsman's steady rhythm, brings us closer to the people who lived there than many royal inscriptions ever do. Those lives were not lesser for their lack of grand proclamations. They were full of work, care, celebration, and the small moral dilemmas of living together. Even the possibilities we find less savory, how grain was allocated in lean years, who cleaned the drains, who paid the craftsmen, are opportunities to ask ethical questions across millennia. How do societies distribute risk, labor, and voice? The material record cannot answer all those questions, but it forces us to ask them. There is also an important methodological lesson in the ambiguity. Our instinct to reach for single-cause explanations, climate change did it, invasion did it, plague did it, obscures the rich, nonlinear dynamics actual societies experience. Empires fall and cities fade for combinations of reasons, and often because of small tipping points as much as dramatic shocks. The sediment cores that show river shifts are powerful, but they must be married to social evidence, storage patterns, craft continuity, isotopic life histories, to build a robust narrative. So too with theories of invasion. Burnt layers and pockets do not automatically translate into citywide cataclysm, and genetic signals of migration must be contextualized with archaeological and linguistic data. Accepting complexity is not a failure of imagination, it is a mature stance that respects the stubbornness of the past. At the same time, we should not let complexity become an excuse for fatalism. The very fact that Mohenjo-Daro's questions remain unresolved is a motivation to innovate, new non-invasive surveying techniques, expanded chronometric databases, and collaborative projects that bring local scholars, international specialists, and indigenous knowledge systems together can shift what we know. There are always practical constraints, funding, politics, the physical fragility of sites, but history rewards perseverance. The Indus script may yet be cracked if a longer corpus turns up, or if a bilingual inscription emerges from a sealed context. Geoarchaeology may map ancient river channels with far greater precision, and bioarchaeology may reveal life histories in greater detail. None of this is guaranteed, but it is plausible, and the past has yielded surprises before. Perhaps the most profound takeaway is ethical rather than technical. Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that every ruin is an appeal to remember, to protect, and to learn in ways that honor the dignity of those who came before. It is too easy to turn ancient cities into moral examples, warnings against environmental mismanagement, triumphant narratives of lost knowledge, or fantasies of advanced ancients. But such lessons must be drawn carefully, with humility. The past is not a didactic tool to be bent to present anxieties. It is a reservoir of human experiments in living that we may consult but never command. When we approach Mohenjo-Daro with both rigor and tenderness, careful in our claims, generous in our wonder, we do justice to the people whose fingerprints press into its artifacts. Finally, there is a personal invitation in the unresolved. If the story of Mohenjo-Daro were perfectly known, it might leave us with admiration but little engagement. Its openness, its invitations to speculate responsibly, and its stubborn mysteries are what keep it alive in our imagination. We stand with a choice: to fill the gaps with lazy romance or with careful inquiry, to appropriate the past as a mirror for present ideologies, or to let it complicate our neat assumptions about progress and decline. If you walk the ruins yourself, or simply hold their images in your mind, you will encounter the same ambivalence. You will feel admiration for ingenuity, sorrow for absence, and a prick of ambition to learn more. So here, at the end of our path through dust and brick, science and story, skepticism and myth, we arrive not with a concluding affidavit but with an earnest exhortation. Treat Mohenjo-Daro as an ongoing dialogue, a site where data and imagination converse, where preservation and interpretation are acts of responsibility, and where every measured brick and every bead offers a modest, human truth. Keep the desire to know alive, but temper it with respect for complexity. Read the seals, study the sediments, listen to the elders who still tell stories in nearby villages, and support practices that let context survive. Because the ultimate lesson Mohenjo-Daro teaches is both simple and profound. The past is not a closed book but a set of half-spoken sentences, and our role is not to finish the story for them but to keep reading carefully, towards whatever insights may come. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.